gospel this morning is taken from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So far our text. Please be seated. Christian friends, I think I might be dating myself, but do you know who that person in the green sweater is? Peppermint Patty. You young people probably have never even heard of Peppermint Patty. Peppermint Patty is ticked. She says, Chuck, it was the first day of school, and I was sent to the principal's office. And Charlie Brown does not appreciate this. He says, why? My fault? Why is it my fault that you got sent to the principal's office? It's your fault, Chuck, because you should have been a better influence on me. You're my friend, right, Chuck? This is all your fault. Now, Peppermint Patty does have a point, doesn't she? All of us are called to be the salt of the earth, and God wants us to be an influence, to be that seasoning in people's lives around us. Well, let's go forward under the theme, you are the salt of the earth. Salt preserves, salt bites, and salt gives wonderful seasoning to life. If you were in the ancient world and you slaughtered an animal to eat it, you had one day before that meat went bad. There was no refrigeration. There was no saran wrap. All you had was salt. So as soon as that meat was cut, if you've been to Old Salem here in Winston, or if you've been to Colonial Williamsburg, you saw the big salt room where they would take the animal and roll it in salt or the meat, and they just smother salt all over it. Because that was the only way you could have meat last more than one day. A lot of jerky. That's how it went. All right, so let's say salt is a very important thing. Roman soldiers were paid in salt if you were worth your salt. It was very valuable. So if you went to the market and you purchased salt, Jesus talks about this in our text, if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You go to the market and you buy salt. It was a common practice, if you wanted to short somebody their salt, to add sand. You get home and you put some of that on your eggs, and you take a bite, and it's pretty easy to tell the difference after you put on your eggs if this is salt or sand. You going to use that again? It's going to go out the window to be trampled by men because it's lost its saltiness. It's not really good for anything. I want to introduce you to a lovely couple. That is John and Ann. And it's an interesting thing when you go through the internet and you try to find stories about people getting married. And some of them even make the newspaper. This couple fell in love. They weren't in bad marriages by any means. They both had children of their own, and yet they kind of got to know each other. And they decided that they didn't want to sneak around. This is what they said in their own words. This is Ann. I didn't want to sneak around with him on the side. I wanted to get up in the morning and read the paper with him. So what John and Ann did was divorced their spouses, and then they got married. And they did this all in the open. They were well aware that this would hurt the people around them and their children, and yet that's what they did because they thought they had to do it because they were soulmates. Yeah. Now, there's plenty of this on the heels of Valentine's Day as you look back, and it's a little nauseating. But I have to ask the question, does that really surprise you? Because let's go back to the meat, okay? So you slaughter the meat. It's been 24 hours and the meat's starting to smell a little funky. Is that the meat's fault? No. That's what meat does. It just rots after a while. Bacteria sets in. The recyclers that God has put into creation take over. These are sinners, just like everyone else in this room. And does it really surprise you that two sinners were selfish and stomped all over the lives of their previous loved one and their children? You kind of have to wonder, shouldn't this happen more often, right? If sinners are left to do what sinners do? The question isn't, why did these two go bad? The question is, where's the salt, right? Is it everyone else around them who should have told them, hey, what you guys are doing is wrong? Do you think anybody took them aside and said, yeah, this is not God-pleasing? Or is our society so corrupt that not only were they not Christian, but they had no Christian friends around them to point out the horror of this incredible sin? You are the salt of the earth. Consider what kind of rot there is in our lives. I know it's easy to pick on those two, but if the only time you express care for your spouse is on Valentine's Day, and the rest of the year you ignore them, well, that's kind of rotten, isn't it? If you go through life and you ignore all of the things that God has brought into your life, all of the good, you don't share that with people. If you ignore your conscience, which He's burned into your hearts, if you act exactly how you shouldn't because it's fun, well, of course that's rotten. We offer God a bouquet of rotten flowers and a box of assorted sins. In return, He gives us the most incredible Valentine the world had ever seen, and that's His Son. He says, be mine, not because we're lovable, because He's merciful. His grace and love overcome everything. And that's what our God does. Yeah, we are salt. Listen to verse 20. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Do you know that the Pharisees had 613 extra rules? And even they couldn't stop sinful thoughts from creeping into their heads. They couldn't stop lust any more than anybody else. They couldn't stop anger and rage. They needed Jesus just like we do, but they denied it. They also needed God. Well, salt preserves because Jesus died for your sins. And He makes you, well, a powerful preserving agent in the lives of everyone around you. But consider how salt bites. If you have a cut, I've used alcohol, I've used hydrogen peroxide. Have you ever used salt? If you get a cut, you take it and you just grind it in there. Usually if somebody says, you're salt in my wounds, that's sarcasm and an insult. But Christian, just think. If there is an open, festering sin in someone's life and you go over there and you point out what God's will is, that's salt in their wounds, and that might save them. Now, I am going to bet that it won't go well for you necessarily. They probably won't like it. But on the back end, they might thank you. I'm sure that these children in these previous two marriages that were ruined would have loved for someone to take their parents aside and put a little salt in that wound. Just point out the horror that was going on. But nobody did. Yeah, it's something to think about. Salt preserves, salt bites. And salt brings wonderful seasoning to life. When I was reading this, there was a phrase that it said, pastors are the syrup of life. Because we go around and we make people feel good about themselves. Now, I wonder if that's really what I want to say about myself. I don't know that I'm really the syrup of life. I'd like to think, as I'm faithful to my calling, that once in a while, I can be salty too. But that's how people sometimes see me. Do I just make people feel good? There was a picture that I could not download, but it was in an art site, and it had a picture of this girl clinging to a rock. She had just been in a shipwreck, and you could see the ship sinking in the background. And she's clinging to this rock for dear life. And the artist did an incredible job giving that picture, and I thought, well, this is really a neat image of what God is for us, how we cling to Jesus, our rock. There was a series of portraits. In the next one, the girl had taken one hand off and was reaching for a little boy who was also lost at sea. And the picture can be a powerful one because so often in life we go through and it's this self-preservation mode. Because it's hard, it really is, to go through life. But then to consider what God has made us to be. You are the salt of the world is pretty much the most unselfish thing. You're putting yourself out there in a dangerous way to help other people. You have been saved. God has already made you something different by His blood. And so now you live not just to cling to the rock, but to reach out and to help people who need it desperately. That's not always an easy thought. The story is told of a pastor who was making a trellis. Vines climb on the trellis and flowers grow off the vine, and it's kind of pretty. And there's a little boy that came and was watching the pastor. And the pastor kept on working a little bit, and after a while he kind of enjoyed having this admirer, and he turns to the boy and said, "Are you here to learn about gardening or carpentry?" And the little boy said, "Neither. I'm here to see what a pastor says when he hits his thumb with the hammer." Oh, that's terrible, isn't it? That someone would follow you around and wait for you to mess up. It's true. People watch everything that you do. People watch how salty you are. And if there's any time when you might lose your saltiness, Jesus says it this way. He uses light as the image. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. I think Peppermint Patty was right. Is it our fault when we look around and we see the people in our lives doing things they ought not and we're silent? Is that just as bad as what they do? I think we ought to be a little careful. I don't want to lay it on too thick because we're not responsible for other people's sins. We're setting ourselves up for huge loads of guilt that God has not given us. And yet I think we do have a duty as salt of the earth to speak and not hold our tongue when we see something. Dear friends, you are the salt of the earth. You can preserve a lot of things, like maybe even a marriage, if you can counsel a couple who's struggling. Salt bites. It's not fun to point out that sin, and yet you might save a soul by your law and gospel proclamation. And finally, salt brings wonderful seasoning to life. May they never see you say something under your breath as you hit a hammer. But if you do, know that God still forgives you. He dusts you off. He sets you up, and He makes you to be what you are, salt. You are salty Christians. Amen. Please stand.